in online, in streaming. We using this platform as a way to kind of connect across time and space. It was clearly due to the COVID emergency that the idea developed, but it seems very successful and also allows us to be in touch with people that are very far away. So we're very pleased. I was going through the requests and I saw people from India, China, the United States, and across all of Europe. So it's an exciting thing to see happening, that it's bringing us together. So today is the third talk of the series. And we have Roberto LALLI giving us some of his research, presenting to us some of his research on the Cold War. And it will be introduced by Simone Turketti, who I will introduce. My name is Azzolini. I often forget to introduce myself, so I should apologize for not having done so in the past. Just a couple of practical things. We ask all participants to keep their microphones switched off and also their videos switched off, at least until question time, so that we can all see the speaker and the chair and respondent. The other thing that I want to mention is these meetings are now recorded and we will be uploading them on the YouTube channel of the Society of SISS. So if you have any objections, you don't want to ask a question yourself, you can write the question in the chat and I'll be very, very happy to read it aloud and make sure that your question is answered. So the format is about 20 minutes for Roberto to present his research and another 5 to 7 minutes to Simone Turketti to give his commentary. There may be questions that Simone will ask and another opportunity for Roberto to answer, after which time we can open up the floor to discussion, and you can kind of make sure you write down in the chat that you want to ask a question so that I can see your name. I will call you, you can unmute and ask a question. So I'd like to introduce now Simone Turketti, who is a colleague who many of you already know, because this seminar series is also connected to the big conference that was to take place live in Bologna, the 9th conference of the European Society for the History of Science. And Simone plays a big role in the society. Unfortunately, the conference, as many of you know, will have to be held online. So we will use Microsoft Teams as a platform to run the conference virtually, a bit like this seminar. Now, Simone is a product of the Italian and the British system. His PhD is from Rome, but his master's and his PhD are from the University of Manchester. And I was rereading his website and saw that his thesis was about a history of the Italian academic refugees in Britain, 1930-1950s. I wonder how many British academic refugees we're going to get with Brexit across Europe. So it's going to be an interesting, for very different political reasons, but still quite a significant loss. Brain drain, I think, will happen there. But what I wanted to say is Simone is an authority in the field of science during the Cold War. His first book, that many of you already know, The Pontecorvo Affair, A Cold War Defection and Nuclear Physics, came out in 2012. But more recently, he has written another monograph, again published with the University of Chicago Press, one of the most prestigious publishers in the history of science, Greening the Alliance, the Diplomacy of NATO's Science and Environmental Initiatives, which kind of takes a green turn. He's also very active in a project, a European project funded by Horizon 2020, inventing a shared science diplomacy for Europe, which also other members that are here today are part. So it's a very active field of research. And his most recent article actually came out this year, the science diplomacy in inverted in brackets, the science diplomacy origins of the Cold War in the historical studies in the natural sciences, that came out in 2020. So I'd like to now pass the baton to Simone to introduce Roberto Lalli, who will give the talk today. And thank you very much.
Okay, hello everyone. I can see it feels a bit like being in a fishbowl for everyone, but we are all together, and we're all together not for me but for Roberto Lalli, a colleague, someone that has been in recent year working on very important issues. Roberto is primarily interested in issues that have to do with the history of modern physics, but it takes this issue at an interdisciplinary level, blending its study with the study of digital humanities, for instance, the study of international relations, which is something that brought him very close to me in a number of things we're doing together. It's a graduate from the University of Milan, but actually it's been spending quite a lot of time abroad, and in particular at the MIT in Boston, and then after that the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, where he's still right now. He has been publishing as well, I think, in very recently, a very important, I think, monograph, building the general relativity and gravitation community during the Cold War, for the Springer Briefs in History of Science and Technology. And I think, if I'm not wrong, Roberto today is going to talk with us about something that really brings that kind of narrative developed in that book forwards. A narrative that obviously looks at the transnational scientific networks of the Cold War periods, episodes of international politics, and in a way tries to make sense of the interplay between contemporary scientists and politicians, especially during the 20th century. So without further ado, I think it's time for Roberto to start his talk, and obviously I hope you'll enjoy it.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you very much for the introduction, Simone, and the invitation to the Italian Society for the History of Science. I'm very excited to be here and to give my talk, which I hope it works. So do you see my slides?
Yes, we do.
Okay, thanks a lot. Because I don't see you, I don't see in my presentation. So what I'm talking today about is the foundation of the European Physical Society, interpreted as a case of science diplomacy within the broader forces of European integration and the Cold War. Science diplomacy is here intended in the specific way of trying to see which were the connections between the activities of scientific communities and international diplomacy, in which one intends, even the same actors, historical actors, intended the promotion of international scientific cooperation as a way, as a tool to condition, albeit in a indirect way, international relations. So the European Physical Society was established in September '68 when the Constitution was signed by about 60 physicists, including 18 representatives of National Physical Society of Eastern and Western European countries plus Israel. At the time, it was one of the very first international institutions that was specifically European and at the same time transcended the Cold War political divide. And it did so at a specific dramatic historical moment. Namely, it was founded only 1 month after the armed invasion of Czechoslovakia by forces of the Warsaw Pact. So one may wonder which were the interconnection between science and politics in the constitution, in the process of foundation of this specific society in this particularly important moment for the Cold War and for the European integration process. That this society was supposed to have a political function was stressed again and again in the public discourse over the society, especially by the first president of the society, Italian cosmic ray and particle physicist Gilberto Bernardini, who had been the main driving force behind the foundation of the society. In his inaugural lecture as president, Bernardini deemed the EPS a contribution to the realization of the cultural unity of Europe. In other public speeches, it was even more explicit in stating that EPS was a contribution to a political project. Namely, it was a support to the process of the European unification, political unification understood as the foundation of a single, highly civilized nation that should be the guiding light of the entire humanity. Whatever we may think about the Eurocentrism, scientism, and naivety of the views exposed by Bernardini in this context, this shows that the promoters of the initiatives saw the society, or at least depicted it in the public discourse, as a diplomatic endeavor aimed at supporting the process of political European integration. I take this political ambition seriously and analyze how the EPS may be understood as a case of science diplomacy. And I do so by elucidating how the involved physicists came to understand their role as those of diplomats and the role of the society as a diplomatic tool amidst the particular turbulent reconfiguration of political relations. The society, however, was not born this way. The society was emerged at CERN in the mid-1960s, 3 years before the foundation. In later comments, CERN is rightly described, as the cradle of the society for its dual function of providing the successful model of European techno-scientific cooperation, and for being the actual place where people could meet and form the transnational network. In fact, all the people involved in the initial idea to found the society were all nuclear and particle physicists working at CERN. However, there is a third element which is usually overlooked in later reconstruction. In the mid-1960s, CERN was not the scientific success it would become more than 10 years later. In 1960, there had been much expectation about the first experiments to be performed with the new protosynchrotron, which for a few months was the greatest, most powerful accelerator in the world. But by the mid-1960s, all the major breakthroughs in particle physics were all done in the US, at the BNL alternating gradient synchrotron. Clearly, by the mid-1960s, European physicists were frustrated and believed that there was a big gap between the organizational and scientific practices in the US and their own. So there was not sufficient to have a big machine. It was necessary to learn how to do big physics, and to do so, they promoted the formation of international structure called the European High Energy Pyramid. It was an informal structure which was composed of small and medium-sized accelerators in CERN member states, and the most powerful accelerator at CERN at the apex of the pyramid. Two of the most important promoters of this CERN pyramid scheme, high-energy pyramid scheme, were Bernardini himself and the director of the Max Planck Institute for Nuclear Physics, Wolfgang Gentner. In June 1965, Bernardini and Gentner drafted a document entitled On the Relation Between National and International Programs. In this document, they stressed that it was necessary to challenge a widespread, and they called it dangerous, public perception that expensive laboratories were, and I quote, an extremely costly self-generating science or benefit of a small company of initiates. So they suggested an ambitious plan to challenge this view, putting at the base of the pyramid scheme medium-sized accelerator not in isolated places far from the cities, but close within physics departments, which would allow the formation, the production of many PhDs in particle physics per year. And very interesting, they linked this action to a political goal. They quote, "This would favor the spread of European scientific culture unbounded by those more humanistic than scientific traditions, which were and still are one of the most serious obstacles to the development of Europe as a nation." So they presented their project, framing it in very strong terms as a diplomatic endeavor where particle physics was supposed to provide the means, the material means, to realize the cultural unity of Europe in support of European political integration. And in this idea, they were appropriating ideas that were promoted at the time by the Council of Europe since the mid-1950s. They were trying to spread the idea of European cultural unity as the support for Western European integration, but also with links to Eastern European peoples. Central figure in this attempt to spread the view of European cultural unity as a political project was Swiss philosopher and writer Denis de Rougemont, who had been in the late 1940s one of the most stronger political promoters of CERN as a step towards stronger cultural and political European integration. So in this attempt, he was relating his political activism for Western European federalism to the idea that European peoples had all the same culture, where for the same cultural unity intended the belief in human's individual freedom, in explicit opposition to the Soviet regime. In view of their strong involvement in the activities of CERN, Bernardini and Gentler were in a suitable position to be immersed in this sort of cultural discourses, which were spread at the time by the Rougemont in Geneva through his European Center for Culture. And just a few months, the drafting of the document I just discussed, Gentler, Bernardini, and others started the process that led to the first meeting on European collaboration in physics, where the foundation of the society was proposed as a way to find a coordinated solution to problems in competition to the most successful US achievements. And in this proposal, Bernardini framed the society, described the society as a single and free association of European physicists. In this meeting, the proposal was enthusiastically welcomed by the 90 physicists, about 90 physicists which were present. Bernardini was given the mandate to build a steering committee in order to fund the society and to involve the National Physical Society, asking for their opinion. Soon after these meetings, tensions started between members of the steering committee and the representatives of National Physical Society. Members of the steering committee believed that in order to be vital and active, the society had to be a free association of individuals. On the contrary, the National Physical Society pushed strongly for the federative solution. The most vocal in this sense was the French Physical Society, which didn't consider the EPS a primordial need. The French Society was very skeptical about the possible activities that the society could perform, and actually stressed that the only real advantage of DPS would be political, in the sense of favoring East-West scientific encounters, from CERN to Dubna, as they wrote in this document. And if this was the main purpose, they argued that it was necessary to have a federative structure because it was the only or the easiest way to get the involvement from Eastern European physicists. This argument was sound. In fact, the participation of Eastern European physicists in international organizations often occurred as representative of national institutions, both for financial and political reasons. However, the members of the steering committee, which were mostly Western European physicists, were strongly against the federative solution because they believed that this solution would have led the society to become a bargaining forum where the most powerful and stronger society would impose their interest to the entire European community. There was also another problems which were raised by the members of the steering committee, which was political. The federative structure implied that it was necessary to define what Europe meant, not only a vague idea of Europe, united Europe, from the Atlantic to the Urals, following de Gaulle's perception, the public discourse, but it was necessary to define which kind of society had to be or could be accepted in this structure. So what to do with the USSR or the GDR, which at that time was not accepted, not recognized by many countries because it was considered an unfriendly act for the Federal Republic of Germany, or even what to do with non-European Mediterranean countries. These were enormous problems. In May 1967, a mediated solution between the free association of individuals and the federative structure was found, and the society drafted, the members of the steering committee drafted the constitution, which allowed both for corporate and individual membership. Apart from the structure of the society, another important point of contention was the function of the society. And the national society obtained that this function was substantially scaled down with respect to the initial ambitions. It was deemed a service organization, not intended as a quasi-political organization which attempt to reorganize physical research on a supranational basis. So this summarized the idea that the society didn't have to be involved with issues that were controversial in terms of national interest. This kind of solution, both the constitution and the hybrid society constitution and the function, left many unhappy, and it was considered even a betrayal with respect to the initial proposal of the society, which was done in Pisa. Moreover, the hybrid character of the society didn't solve the political problems. It still implied that it was necessary to define Europe, which kind of society, national societies, could be accepted in this European society. And this implied that in order to build a society which was really European and not only Western European, it was necessary to spread eastward the membership of the EPFs, which by that time was composed mostly by Western European physicists, apart from one Polish scholar, Maria Denis, who was the only representative for the entire Eastern European community, and also to involve the greater possible number of Eastern European societies. In order to do that, there was many attempts to get in touch with that Eastern European physicists, and this was very successful. Non-Soviet Eastern European physicists were very enthusiastic about this initiative, and Czechoslovak physicists also organized a meeting of the steering committee in Prague in May '68, just in the midst of the Prague Spring. And this assured high participation from Eastern European physicists. In the months preceding the Prague meeting, the diplomatic function of society was made public again and again, not only by Bernardini, but also by other members of the steering committee of physicists involved, also by Eastern European physicists, in particular by František Januk, who was one of the organizers of the Prague meeting, where in this public discourse he made on the Foundation of European Physical Society, he stressed the same theme made public by Bernardini, namely that the European Physical Society was a way to contribute to European cultural unity and to the East-West peaceful relation. So while the theme of cultural unity dominated the public discourse, the actual negotiations were, of course, related to which kind of society could be accepted, with many tension arising with respect to the acceptance of the Israeli physical society, because Israel and the Soviet bloc countries had disrupted diplomatic relation with Israel after the Six-Day War, and also within the Soviet Pact, there were many tensions about the entrance of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, because the Soviet Academy of Sciences didn't deem the European Physical Society something that they should enter in, while all the other groups of physicists or Eastern European countries wanted to join the society. So the Soviet Academy of Sciences at the end capitulated and decided to join in order not to show disunity within the Soviet bloc. After this strong political negotiation, which ended in a successful way with the entrance of both the Israeli Physical Society and the Soviet Academy of Sciences, there was much optimism that the society would be founded in September '68 with the participation of society from most of Europe. But just 1 month before the official foundation, the invasion of Czechoslovakia disrupted completely, of course, this optimism. And Januk immediately sent a letter calling for a scientific boycott of all Soviet conferences and Soviet delegations. Januk asked his Western colleague, and I quote, "Let Soviet scientists share in the shame and feel the responsibility for their country and government." So this was a strong request for a scientific boycott, and this, of course, created serious problems that had to be discussed before the foundation. It was necessary to decide what to do. If postponing the foundation of the society, funding the society as planned, or funding the society, excluding the society of the countries involved in the armed invasion of Czechoslovakia. In order to discuss these issues, an urgent meeting of the steering committee was called in 12 September '68, and during this discussion, the majority of Western European physicists became more and more explicit in their views that liberal democratic values were central tenets in the future society. The Czechoslovak crisis led these Western European physicists to reconfiguring the society as a tool to spread anti-totalitarian value based on the principle of individual freedom, especially in support of Eastern European dissident scientists. And this kind of interpretation of the society as a tool, or diplomatic tool, was emphasized by Januk himself. He recognized that his early call for a boycott was dictated by emotion, but a more reasoned judgment was now necessary in order to fashion the society into a diplomatic tool. And Januk argued that funding society as planned was the best way to supporting Czechoslovak physicists in this moment of crisis. Once the society had been formed, it could then become a political actor and find diplomatic ways in the international arena to support Czechoslovak physicists. And this was what happened. This decision led to the foundation of society, which included the countries you can see in the map in the slide, with plasma physicist Lev Arsimovich signing the constitution as the official representative of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. The idea envisaged during this dramatic meeting between the invasion of Prague and the foundation of society, that the society could become, once established, active in supporting dissident Eastern European scientists, became realized a few years after the foundation of society. Januk was elected a member of the EPX executive committee, and around 1970, at the same time, the situation in Czechoslovakia deteriorated for those who were overly critical about the invasion of Czechoslovakia and the new political ruling. So Januk was politically persecuted, he lost his position, and became isolated from his peers. And then the EPS became a support network that made pressures to the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences to restore Januk's working position or to allow him to accept a position abroad. And then this pressure, according to Januk's recollection, were successful. Januk was allowed to leave the country in 1973 and to accept a position in Sweden, which was also secured through the EPS network by the second president of the society, Erik Rudberg. A few years later, Januk founded the Charter 77 Foundation, which was the main funding agency in support of the Charter 77, which was the main opposition group in his native Czechoslovakia. So to conclude, in the last 2 decades, science diplomacy has become a major topic in the discourse over the interconnection between science and policy and foreign relations. Many projects, which you can see in the slide, are now in the way that try to delve into the discourse and practices of science diplomacy. Some of them also include the attempt to understand how history can help understand science diplomacy exercise. In all this project, in the general definition of science diplomacy, a central tenet is that the national states and the national interests are extremely important, are essential to defining the science diplomacy activity. This is correct, this is rightly so, but what I wanted to show here that there may be an alternative perspective which focuses on transnational networks on non-state agents, in this case physicists who were not necessarily aligned with the interests of the national states they belong to, which tried and actually in a certain way succeeded in influencing international relations without any direct or explicit involvement of the national states. So thank you very much for the attention. If you want to know more, this paper will be published in fall 2020 in the special issue of Centaurus Global Perspective on Science Diplomacy and the Cold War, edited by Matthew Adams and myself, and I invite you all to the panel Diplomacy Images in Science, organized by Commission of Science, Technology and Diplomacy from the next European Society for the History of Science conference. Thanks a lot for the attention.
Thank you very much for Roberto for your engaging talk. And as you can see, not only the field is a booming area of research where much is being written and is in the process of being written, but now we can hear Simone Turketti's comments on the paper and then open up the floor for discussion after that. So Simone.
Yeah, thanks, Roberto. That was really fascinating material, and I'm sure that soon it will come up, aside from your publication for Centaurus, into something more substantial, something that perhaps, you know, it's a new monographic work of sorts. Just to go back to some of the, let's say, the paper's tenets, I think, first of all, I think the paper is obviously a genuinely original contribution to ongoing work on the history of science diplomacy, as you managed to, as you pointed out right at the end of your talk. And perhaps just for the members of the audience who have not been clapping your paper, but I'm pretty much sure with the spirit, they were definitely with you in kind of supporting what you were saying. I would say, you know, let's first of all kind of clarify what do we mean by science diplomacy and why science diplomacy is an important issue in your paper. It is a term that has been adopted fairly recently. It denotes generally how we can think of international scientific collaborations in general as ways to build constructive relations between administrations, states, governments. It is attracting growing attention, not just because of one of the pamphlets you show in your last slide, that is to say this very, let's say, prestigious publication by the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Royal Society, who in 2010 published jointly this pamphlet claiming that essentially science diplomacy could represent a new way to approach foreign relations, but also because over the years, and especially very recently, we could see the merits of science diplomacy, for instance, in the recent reopening of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States under the Barack Obama administration, where actually the connections existing between the Cuban Academy of Sciences and the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, were seen as relevant and instigating the kind of detente, if you want, effort happening at the time. So there is a kind of sense of interest around these words, this buzzword, I would say, science diplomacy, and is an interest that is distinctive not just of the community of the historians of science. It's much broader than that. It encompasses international relations scholars, historians interested in the 20th century, sociologists, and many more scholars. There's quite a lot of interest also at European level. You mentioned the European projects focusing on science diplomacy that have been launched recently and that some of us are contributing to. What can we do as historians of science to kind of better understand what science diplomacy is and how science diplomacy can, in a way, become not just a device in the political arena, but also a device to reread, reinterpret the history of science? Well, you mentioned already one thing that we can do is, first of all, to start to unite forces as historians and collectively think of ways in which we can build spaces for collective analysis. You mentioned one of these places, which, I mean, obviously you're also a member, so you know fully well what we are doing. That is to say, this Commission on Science, Technology and Diplomacy, which is operating under the aegis of the Division of History of Science and Technology, which is the international forum, if you want, the international association promoting the history of science at the international level. Within the Commission, we have a number of initiatives to foster the understanding of science diplomacy from an historical perspective. And I mean, for those of you who usually don't know enough about this, I just want to say in this context that over these years, the Commission is was established fairly recently in 2017. Roberto has been a wonderful contributor to the activities of the Commission and helping essentially to make it grow and thrive. And I think the paper that Roberto presented today is really a genuine demonstration of how I think we can explore the history of science diplomacy in meaningful ways. I think 2 points that Roberto makes are particularly relevant here. I think, first of all, his effort to read the scientific project for the European Physical Society as a diplomatic effort is very original, very innovative, and it's something that perhaps we should think more in the future. And the second, I think, important point he makes is this effort to reread the history of landmarking a scientific project or big science projects, also at European level, not as an emanation of national interest, but actually as a product of transnational contamination, transnational collaboration. I think all of this is very promising. It's something that we should think more in the future. But perhaps a third and final point I want to make is, I mean, how do we historians of science not just try to revisit the field so as to, if you want, rekindle the dialogue amongst ourselves, but actually how can we speak out there, for instance, to historians, contemporary historians? And I think Roberto here is offering quite a lot of interesting messages that go beyond essentially our field, and in particular, his effort to reread the dramatic events in Prague in 1968 in light of what the EPS was doing, I think is remarkable, in the sense that it's perhaps telling to 20th century historians, well, we shouldn't read the history of Prague just in terms of the political events, the dramatic social events that happened at the time, but also in terms of how the community of scientists actually mobilized to find a solution. Now, whether this was an effective solution or not is not something that is for me to say in this context, but it is certainly a novel way to read what happened in Prague in 1968. And I want to finish here because I think I have talked for my allocated 5 minutes with just a simple, but perhaps very pertinent question to Roberto, which is, obviously, would, how to say, agree with you 100% that the EPS had also this kind of diplomatic dimensions. But if I mean, accept your understanding of that, then I'm wondering what kind of reactions the EPS activities produced, and especially in the United States and the Soviet Union. I would expect then, if you're right, that the efforts to set up the EPS, especially the kind of interlocking with the Prague events, would have created some kind of, I wouldn't say enmity necessarily in the United States and the Soviet Union, but perhaps some kind of tensions and frictions. Is that the case, or maybe not? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the comments and for the question. So I start with the questions. This is something I expected as well. So there is a methodological problem to that it's in a way conditioning my possibility to respond to your question. My research was done on specific archives related to the EPS, so it's very difficult from them to get the reaction what happened aboard, and what they tried to find I was unable to find in the archives. One of the problems concerning this, a larger problem, is that working with the reaction in Soviet Union is far from simple. What we know is that the Soviet Academy of Sciences was opposing the EPS, but there were negotiations within the Soviet bloc which essentially convinced the Soviet Academy of Sciences to join before the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And after that, there were arguments within the Western European physicists that the Soviet Academy of Sciences continued to be willing to show in order to be part, to show that the situation was in a certain way normalized already 1 month after the invasion of Czechoslovakia. So these were arguments put forward by the Western European physicists, which were the ones I could look in the documents, the archives I explored. For the US reaction, unfortunately, I haven't found any signs that there was a strong reaction. And actually, 2 of the members of the steering committee were Euro-American, were Europe-born physicists who work in the US, which were very much connected to Europe for the scientific organization of scientific activity. One of them was also Cécile de Witt-Moret, who, as you know, organized the Leausch seminar series and were supported also by NATO. So I tried to find some material in the archives of those scholars, but I didn't find any strong American reaction. So I'm not sure if it was considered irrelevant by the US, or if it wasn't relevant, I wasn't able to find any reaction.
Thank you.
Thank you. Simone, do you want to add anything, or shall we open the floor?
I think we should open the floor to discussion.
Okay, let's open the floor to discussion. If anybody has a question, as I said, you can indicate your name in the chat function. And if you don't want to unmute your microphone and ask the question yourself, you can type the question and I'll read it for you. Anybody with questions? This is, I've learned a great deal because this is way out of my comfort area, being an early modernist. So it's been a very interesting talk. And I also feel, as Simone was saying, this kind of work is very much needed to place the history of science firmly within the broader historical debate, because so many times historians who do contemporary history, but also modern history more generally, are ignoring a lot of the research that goes on in the history of science, which actually gives an additional and often important perspective to the whole debate. So thank you very much. So I see some questions. Fabio Bevilacqua, if you would like to unmute your microphone and ask your questions, and then Erika.
Thanks, Roberto, and thanks, Simone and the organizers. I just want to...
We can't hear you. Can you get closer to the microphone, please? Fabio, we can't hear you very well.
Okay, can you hear me now?
No, I'm afraid not. It's very, very far away, at least for me.
Okay, then I'll try to fix my settings.
We can't listen. We can't hear anything. We're not hearing.
Maybe we can go to the second question, and when Fabio fixes the problem.
That's right. So Erika, would you like to ask your question, and then we go back to Fabio Bevilacqua?
Okay, thank you very much, Roberto, for your really interesting, intriguing talk. It was a pleasure to hear this paper. And just a very trivial question about I wonder if you can enter in some more detail about the status of Israel, because I think it's a key issue in science diplomacy and in the historical value of rereading the history of modern physics, but also modern mathematics in the period you considered. And so, if you have...
Sure, yeah. It was a problem, not only, of course, that this was a general problem at the time after the Six-Day War. Essentially, all the conferences organized in Soviet Union, but also in Soviet bloc countries, mostly in Soviet Union, it started a hidden boycott of Israeli physicists or scientists who were denied the visa, couldn't obtain the visa to attend conferences in the Soviet Union. And it was, of course, a huge problem according to what had been defined as the principle of free circulation of scientists, which was then promoted by International Union and the International Council of Scientific Union. So there were many attempts in various groups to challenge this problem. There were also attempts to boycotting, and this is everywhere in the IPPAP. In other groups I studied in this particular context, it was more complex, because in that case it was not the participation of scientists, but was the participation of a national physical society. And so some scholars, when the Eastern European physicists entered the conversation, was after the Six-Day War. But the process started before, and Israeli physicists were part of the process. There was one important physicist, Amos Deschali, in Israel, who was part of the steering committee since the beginning, so was more present and more active than European physicists, essentially, which were not there. So Israel was just given for granted by Western European physicists, that when the Western European physicists tried to ask for elucidation about the definition of Europe, how do we define Europe, and stated quite explicitly, Israel is not Europe, it's like United States. They said, no, Israel is part, like every other Mediterranean non-European countries, when will they have the need, or will they have enough physics in their nations to join the society? So this was the general conflict, and at the end, most European physicists accepted, even because it was before the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and then they wanted to show some kind of independence, in particular Czechoslovak physicists during the Prague. The Prague Spring, they wanted to show independence, and so they wanted to they accepted the presence of Israel. So that was the story.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Fabio Bevilacqua, if you want to try, otherwise I will read your comment. I just want to recall that the status, yeah, we can't hear you.
Any better?
I'm sorry. We seem to have problems with Fabio Bevilacqua, but Roberto, you can read his comment. I just want to recall that the statutes of APS played an important role in the foundation of the European Society for the History of Science, especially for the stress on individual members, which seems very pertinent given the setting of this seminar. Thank you.
Thanks, Fabio.
We would probably actually all know more about the foundation of the European Society for the History of Science. I personally feel I don't know enough about the topic, so I should read up on their website. Now, Wang, if you could, if you want to unmute your microphone and ask your question. I'm afraid I don't want to mispronounce your first name, so I will just stick to the surname.
You're muted.
So you need to unmute your microphone, and then you can ask your question. Is one muted? Yeah, no, that's not. So, oh, there you go. We can't hear. Do you want to type it? Yes, you can type it and I can read it. Okay, meanwhile, is there anybody else who has questions while we're waiting for our colleague to write his question in the chat?
I mean, if nobody is intervening, I will, because I have something else I wanted to ask Roberto, which is, I mean, do you see this given this political dimension of the EPS activities? Do you see them? I mean, do you see other events after the Prague 1968 one that are also relevant in the history of the society as highlighting that interlocking of science and diplomacy again?
So thanks for the question. This is something I'm trying to explore, but at the moment I am not sure. What I found was of course, in the moment of the end of the Cold War, they started a kind of cultural programs in physics that, of course, had to do with the European integration, with cultural integration. But this is essentially, this was an implementation of the original aim. They couldn't do anything that was controversial from the perspective of national interest, as obtained by the National Physical Society, but they could, and they wanted, and actually they did. They wanted to have an important role in the education of physicists, in the exchange of physicists, and of course there might be many hidden stories in the grand narratives, which I had to find. I haven't studied them yet, but I'm sure that the educational programs were very much also in the sense of European integration all over the time. So in the sense they had and designed to be in a way political, exactly in the sense of cultural unification, which again, probably they had intrinsic, more or less explicit also, the idea of sharing liberal diplomatic values. I mean, the freedom of individuals was always more or less in these educational programs. But this is something that I'm trying to understand how to explore future projects.
Thank you. So I can read Wang's question. He says, great presentation, board role in APS in regard to Prague. Was the EPS response to Prague a model for American response to the Soviet refusnik in the 1970s? Apologies. Do you want to answer, Roberto?
Sorry. I'm not sure. Agebor was not present in the negotiations. Agebor was not a member of the steering committee when they discussed them. They was very much present at the beginning in the first meeting, but essentially they done, because there was also in the steering committee, there was a national component, a national representation. So then the real Danish guy close to Agebor was Christian Müller, of course, who was a major figure in all these kinds of transnational networks, in the CERN, as you know, in the gravitation community I worked on. So Christian Müller I'm pretty sure that there might be some discussion between them, but Agebor was not really an actor then. That's a great question, the second question. This is something I would like to explore. I don't, that's a really great question. I'm not sure. That's a great idea, essentially, but something that I would like to explore. Thanks for the idea, but I haven't thought about that. No, that's simply great.
Excellent. Very good. I see that people are clearly very knowledgeable, and they're going to kind of specific details, which is always great for discussion and reflection among the specialists. Ilaria Ampolini asked, I might have missed something, but I was wondering if and how this political dimension was perceived by public opinion, and how, for example, in newspapers and public debates, and how, sorry, yeah.
Thanks for the question. Unfortunately, there isn't much about the, at least I didn't find much concerning the public perception. I know what the physicists tried to do in, what is the public image they wanted to convey to the audience they talked to at the time. So they wanted clearly to convey the political dimension. How this was received by the public, this is something that I am unable to say, because there are very short articles, and even some which are very interesting, but also quite wrong, at least with the perception of those who worked on the foundation of DPS. One, perhaps funny for us, but very telling about the misconception in the United States, is a very short article, maybe even in Scientific American, sorry, I don't remember correctly, which understood the foundation of EPS as a Catholic project, very close to the citizen, so to the Vatican City. So there is very different, the very few presentation newspaper of the society, there are very different views, and the public dimension was not particularly relevant, even though the political dimension was the one that was stressed in the public presentation by Bernardini, essentially, and other physicists. But of course, there might be many newspapers which I was unable to find in the archives I looked to. But this is also a very nice question. So I was unable to find more than a few newspaper article which gave only very minor detail about the physical society. They stressed that there was the attempt to build the cultural unit. They repeated essentially Bernardini words. So, but apart from that, I'm not sure how to weight the public perception. They repeated most of the time Bernardini's words, or made some interpretation which were questionable with respect to some people. But of course, the connection with the Vatican City has some grain of truth for some of the members. So that is actually an interesting way to look at the society, which also at a certain point involved Antonino Zichichi and one other member was strongly related to the attempt to rehabilitate Galileo with the Vatican. So there were many, of course, many souls within the physical society, and the public representation of that show this variety. When it goes to the political, almost always they repeated this, only Bernardini's word on the cultural unity of physics, contribution to this attempt to cultural unity.
Thank you very much. I was actually, I'm glad you elaborated on that, because I was wondering why there was this perception that the Vatican, there was a kind of a Catholic discourse behind it, but you kind of filled in the gaps, and there was a grain of truth in those kind of suspicions, I guess.
Yeah. I can say a little bit more. That there was Georges Benet was an important member of the steering committee, which did a lot in order to shape the constitution of the society. Who essentially was the guy who presented all the political problems. It was not the main promoter, but it was one very much involved in the creation of transnational network. It was the secretary of a Groupement Ampere in French, which was one of the very early Cold War international association, which tried really to build an East-West participation of individual scientists, and it was very much close to the Vatican, to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. So it was the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, the connection. He was connected, and then also Antonino Zichichi, who had also a personal relationship with Gilberto Bernardini, who would, of course, later be a central player in Italian physics and even in the European Physical Society, was a president and so on. So it was not completely out of pretty false, but it was much more complex. What I wanted to focus on was another story, but that is, of course, quite interesting, even though it's minor in my view.
But as you say, the perception may have been kind of, flowed by the people involved, but it's interesting that was picked up, those connections.
Yeah, they protested against this article. They sent a letter that was completely false what they wrote.
Okay, now we have a question from Brigitte. If you would like to unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes.
I cannot put my video on, I'm afraid, but it's me.
No problem.
Thank you very, very much for this presentation, Roberto. I was very interested in many ways, also because the European Chemical Society is created in 70, and while the idea seems to be the same, the context within 2 years is completely different. So I learned a lot, and I'm really looking forward to read your paper. I have many questions, but there are two I'd like to ask now. And it's some way related to the public perception, or at least the perception. So one point is, are there other examples than the example of the Czech Janusz, of physicists from the Eastern country who have been supported publicly by the European Physical Society? And then from there, I'd like to know whether the normal members also had the impression to play in this diplomacy, or if it was only in the mind of a few leaders.
Could you please be at a certain point? Your voice was a little bit strange. The second question was not completely clear. Could you please shortly repeat the second one?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So yes. So my second point is, how much or how far do we know whether the members themselves realize the part they were playing in this scientific diplomacy? Whether, in other terms, whether or not this is a discourse from the leaders and a few supporters, or if it's really a value that is supported by the whole European Physical Society.
Okay, that's a good question. Okay, so for the second question, that's it's quite difficult to say. There are when there was a problem. I mean, it's very difficult also to identify the society, the members of the society as large, because as I mentioned, at the end the society had a strange constitution. It was it allowed for individual membership, but it was mostly based on corporate membership, where the members of the national society were individual members of the EPS. It means that all the members of the National Physical Society were members of the EPS. There is no way of course, to map the perception of all this person who might also have any will to join the society. They had to, they were to join the European Society because the National Physical Society joined the EPS, were part of the EPS. So it's a very difficult question to answer, but it's certain that during the meeting of the steering committee, which were of course leaders in the field, there is no doubt about that, this was a widespread view, even with the Eastern European physicists. It was really accepted that the EPS was to play this kind of supporting role for dissidents. In particular, they mentioned Sakharov. Of course, we watched was the most outspoken dissident, when dissident as a word didn't even exist in Soviet Union. So they. But what the decision was to act in an informal way. What does it mean? They didn't want to create a situation that led to the Eastern European society to left the society, or put those who agreed with the Western European values to be in danger for their participation. So it was very clear since the beginning of the the discourse about how to solve Yanukov's situation, that the society had to have a diplomatic hidden role. So to a support network. So in this support network, we can see many actors who were not necessarily leaders, who pushed in a way for helping scientists. And the idea was to help all Czechoslovak physicists who had the same problem as Januk. They were discriminated politically, all lost his position. But Januk was the most clear case where we have evidence about. And the way they did so was, again, through offering a position abroad and through some sort of hidden pressure, letters to the Czechoslovak, but without pressuring so much, because they didn't want to create a real tension. What the act that really worked very well, and that was the problem within the Soviet bloc, was that the Czechoslovak group, which joined the DPS, wanted to organize a conference of DPS in Prague. And the president then asked, okay, we organize the conference in Prague, but we have to solve the Januk issues before that. And there was a broad agreement with this action of the president. The Czechoslovak were very, of course, didn't accept this kind of request, and they said that they would go away from the society. But eventually, the Romanian society proposed to host the conference in Romania. So there was a gap between the interest of the National Physical Society in the East, and through this kind of competition between Eastern European society, then at the end, Janusz was allowed to leave. So I tried to answer both questions at once. Was it clear?
Yes, thank you very much. It's passionnant. C'est passionnant.
Yes.
Thank you.
That's very good. We also have a comment. Luc Berge, a remarkable talk on the history of EPS. Thanks a lot, Roberto. We learned a lot. And then he suggests you send your published version to David Lee, EPS Secretary General, in order to spread it among the EPS members and even beyond. So that's an endorsement that people in the society really need to also learn the history behind it. So That sounds very good. Are there any other questions? There are still about 45 people connected, so it's a good audience that has remained with us all along.
There is a comment by Ezio Vaccari.
Sorry.
And the question too, I guess.
A question for both Simone and Roberto from Ezio Vaccari. In August 1968, the International Geological Congress was taking place in Prague when the invasion occurred and the scientific activities were cancelled. There was a big shock for the geological community at the time. Do you think that it could be interesting to compare the reaction of the International Union of Geological Sciences with that of EPS and other scientific institutions? That's a great question. To you, Roberto. Okay,
can start with Simone. Yeah, absolutely. That's what I want to do. The book I mentioned, that Simone mentioned, was about the relativity community, which also was involved in how to react to the Prague meeting, and it's part of my future research program, if I find the fund to do that, to compare to the transnational, the reaction of institutionalized transnational network with those of intergovernmental or semi-intergovernmental institution. So the International Union had a completely different structure usually than this individual free membership society, or tend to be free membership society. But it's one of the issue I would like to explore, how these institutions, international institutions, were affected and trying to answer to go ahead in spite or in connection to these dramatic changes. That's an important point. What the main essential institutional difference, and the international unions, I think all of them but the mathematical union, but maybe you can correct me, they were all based on the idea of national membership. So that means that in the view, at least of the Eastern European physicists who joined the International Union, they were representative, official representative of state or quasi-state national association. And so there was a different structure, which of course might have played a big role in how they could react to this dramatic event in international political relations. So I guess that one major issue is within the structure itself. While the EPS was not even born, at that point was just a group of leading high-level physicists who were trying to build a society which, in the constitution, they wrote they didn't accept any connection with the government. So they had a very different structure, at least in their desires. If this happened or not, of course, was a connection with the structure of Eastern European science. Simone, do you want to add something? Because
I think you said everything. I mean, if any, it is a more theoretical level. Let's say that obviously in the domain of science diplomacy is always very interesting to see this kind of multi-layered domains where you have some organizations directly depending either from governments, other be non-governmental, but for instance, tied to a system of memberships, other, tied to other sorts of constitutive element. In the case of the European Physical Society, obviously the kind of underlying European discourse. So it's kind of this multi-layered dimension that is kind of interesting to explore when we go into the kind of researching of the history of science diplomacy.
Any more questions? If there are no more questions, I'd like first to kind of show my face to thank you all. I should at least do that. I'd like to thank both Simone Turketti and Roberto LALLI for a very engaging discussion. One of the most exciting things of these events is precisely the discussion that happens after the paper. The paper is fairly short. We try to kind of keep it brief, but the discussion is always very, very lively. And it's been a great pleasure to coordinate this, because I learn a lot, and also the participants seem to really enjoy the discussion. I'd like to now remind you that we have our last paper of the series, which is in 2 weeks' time, on the 16th of July at 6 p.m. as usual. Cristiano Turbil will speak about medicine and politics in the newly Italian household, constructing a scientifically literate citizenship in post-unified Italy, 1861-1900. As usual, you can write to the SISS seminars address to get your link and be allowed into the virtual seminar room. But once again, I'd like to thank our speakers, and I think the round of applause is due. So thank you very much for a very engaging talk. And I'm really glad that also Roberto kind of advertised his symposia at the European Society for the History of Science conference. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that now the conference has a Twitter account. We just launched it. So look for us, look us up on Twitter. There is also the Twitter account of the Society for the History of the Italian Society for the History of Science, is SISS _outreach. And I will put both of these pieces of information in the chat at the end of the talk, so that you can keep up to date. And also we will release information about the program going live, and then maybe showcase some themes running through the conference between now and August. So the 16th of July wraps things up for us. We have a little well-deserved break, all of us, and then we'll see each other again for the European Society for the History of Science conference in Bologna, although we're not going to be in Bologna. So thank you very much once again. Thank you, Roberto, and thank you, Simone. It has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye to everybody.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao Roberto.
Grazie, grazie. Ciao.
Bye, Roberto.